concept of class difference is something that has been around for thousands of years. People's lives depend on what social class they belong to. Whether it is money, religion, race, or values that separate these people, they are always striving to make something better of themselves. In Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, class difference is the cause of a lot of the problems in the story. In Girl with a Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier, class difference is the reason the story even exists. Both stories revolve around young women who are forced into higher classes. They have to figure out how to fit into these classes without completely forgetting their morals and where they came from. In both stories, class difference is a recurring theme. The young women learn that classes separate people into specific social groups, higher classes act like they are better than lower classes, and that lower classes always end up working harder than upper classes. In both Pride and Prejudice and Girl with a Pearl Earring, classes separated people into specific social groups. In Pride and Prejudice, the Bennets were a middle-class family, while Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley belonged to the upper class. A rich man was expected to marry rich, so when rumor went around that Elizabeth was engaged to Mr. Darcy, his family was outraged. His aunt even came to the Bennets' estate just to scold Elizabeth for thinking she was good enough for her nephew. In her opinion, classes should not mix. In that time period, people were not even supposed to mingle with people of a lower class, so marrying someone like that was considered absurd. In Girl with a Pearl Earring, classes also separated people into specific social groups. The main difference between people in this story was religion. There were Catholics and Protestants, and they did not ever socialize with each other. On page 13, Tracy Chevalier wrote about Catholics. They kept to themselves. They were tolerated in Delft, but they were expected not to parade their faith openly. This showed the Protestants' opinion of the Catholics. Greet was a Protestant, but the Vermeers were Catholic. She felt very uncomfortable in their house, and they acted like she was an outsider at first. Eventually, Greet grew used to the Catholicism, but she never felt completely comfortable around it. This was due to the nature of class difference in her city. Social class determined who could talk to who in both stories, and people were not willing to change that. Secondly, in both Pride and Prejudice and Girl with a Pearl Earring, higher classes acted like they were better than lower classes. In Pride and Prejudice, the Bennet family worried for their youngest daughter, Lydia. She ran off to get married to a poor man. Since the Bennets were a middle-class family, it was almost unthinkable to them that their daughter would marry someone of a lower class. Mrs. Bennet locked herself in her room for days because of the shame and embarrassment Lydia had brought them. Although Lydia's husband was just searching for money, the Bennets were concerned about what other people would think. They did not want to be associated with a lower class. In Girl with a Pearl Earring, higher classes also acted like they were better than lower classes. Since Greet was a maid, and maids were considered low class, the Vermeers treated her poorly and acted like she was not even a real person. On page 63, Tracy Chevalier wrote, "I said no. It is I who decide what you can and cannot do." Greet was getting scolded because she asked to go see her family, who were being quarantined due to the plague. Although she knew it was risky, her mistress still felt the need to rudely assert her dominance over her. Greet could not even ask a simple personal question without getting yelled at. Since she was a low-class maid, the Vermeers did not care about her, and they thought it was a waste of time to talk to her unless it regarded any maid work. In both stories, people of higher classes treated people of lower classes poorly and acted like they were better at everything. Lastly, in both Pride and Prejudice and Girl with a Pearl Earring, class difference showed that lower classes always end up working more than higher classes. In Pride and Prejudice, the Bennet family needed to find someone who could take care of the women once Mr. Bennet passed away. They stressed over balls and associated with rich people in order to find that right person. Although it seemed like the average thing to do, this family had to work very hard to get Elizabeth and Jane to marry rich men. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley barely had to lift a finger in the process. Since they were in a higher class, they knew that middle-class people would happily marry them. Even though the girls were very wary of them at first, it was smooth sailing once the men used their money to prove they were good people. Jane and Elizabeth worked hard to control their feelings and seemed like proper young ladies, while Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley used the power of money in their favor. They did not work nearly as hard to marry the girls as the girls did to marry them. In Girl with a Pearl Earring, the lower class also worked harder than the upper class. In this story, it was Greet who had to work harder than the Vermeers in order to make a living. On page 233, Tracy Chevalier wrote, "A maid came free." This shows that no matter how much work Greet did, she would never be worthy of anything to anybody. She had to do work all day long and all day night just to get enough money for her family to survive, while the only working person in the Vermeer household was Johannes, the painter. Greet got nothing but an unhappy life in return, but the rest of the Vermeer family got to live with riches even though they were piled in debt. In both stories, the lower classes were forced to work harder than the upper classes in order to survive. In conclusion, both Pride and Prejudice and Girl with a Pearl Earring shared a recurring theme about class difference. Both stories taught a lesson that classes separate people into exclusive social groups, higher classes act like they are better than lower classes, and that lower classes always end up working harder than upper classes. In Pride and Prejudice, it was a middle-class family trying to find their way into the upper class. In Girl with a Pearl Earring, it was a low-class maid trying to support her family while dealing with maid work for a higher-class family. In both stories, young women had to learn about class difference and how to handle it. Luckily, the young women both ended up escaping their biggest struggles and living better lives than they had ever imagined.